welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're in a short new series on hunting controversies and solutions. I was warned not to cover this topic because it's probably the most controversial and maybe divisive one in the deer hunting world, which is chronic wasting disease, or CWD. But we're going to look at it because I think it's important to know about and discuss. We'll get an overview of what it is, how states have handled or mishandled it, and opinions on potential solutions from a DNR biologist, two top scientists, and a very knowledgeable deer farmer. And if you want to go on a rant about it or just write some of this quality information down, our free journal is the best way to do that. You can find it below. Okay, our first guest is Chad Stewart, elk, moose, and deer management specialist of the Michigan DNR. Here are a couple things to look for from him. What do we know and not know about CWD? What has worked to combat it and what hasn't? And how are we measuring the effectiveness of the actions that state DNR agencies are taking to stop its spread? And there's a ton more high IQ stuff in there as always. So let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. To start out, Chad, could you give us just a brief overview for people that aren't up on it? What is CWD and what we know about it and what we don't know about CWD?
Oh man, that's like I could talk for an hour just on those two things. I guess, so CWD is the acronym for the disease that's called chronic wasting disease. And chronic wasting disease is a neurodegenerative disease that affects members of the cervid family. So white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose, caribou, it's all been found in those. There's probably a few exotic species I'm missing as well. But basically what it is it's caused by an agent called a prion, and prion in and of itself is not a bad thing. We all have prions in our body, but what happens with these neurodegenerative diseases is that these prions have a typical shape that allows them to function, and then they get misfolded. And then this misfolding of this prion gets copied by other prions in the body and essentially starts to cause degeneration in the brain tissue. So it's part of a group of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Transmissible being that it can be passed from one individual to another individual. Spongiform basically meaning, the degenerative action that is basically turning the brain tissue at the cellular level to a spongy-like appearance. So it basically is developing holes in the brain. And then encephalopathy is basically meaning, brain degeneration. So I've lost track of how many states and provinces it's been identified in. I think it's up around like 30 at this point states. I think 2 or 3 different provinces in Canada have identified it. The concern with these prion-based diseases is that, prions are not living organisms. So it's not like a virus or a bacteria that you can just provide some sort of, vaccine or something for. Like, we don't know how to stop these prion-related diseases. And because prions aren't alive, it means you can't kill them. So when these prions are shed out into the environment through saliva, urine, feces, they persist there. For an unknown period of time, but, seemingly infectious for years. And there's even been documentation of these prions remaining infective after they've been taken up into plant tissue. So in that regard, one individual animal has the potential to transmit the disease to another individual animal and never come into contact with that animal. So this is a concern for a lot of big game or cervid biologists across the country and across North America, and certainly even into Europe, where it's been identified in caribou as well. So it's something that there's a lot of time and effort and interest and money being devoted to the research of this disease. So that's a really short overview of it, Adam. I don't know if that works for you or not.
That's good. Continuing on from that, what is something you feel the public may not understand about CWD, and why do you think it has become such a controversy in the hunting community?
Oh boy,
because you'd think a disease wouldn't be a controversy, but it really has turned into that.
Well, I think a lot of diseases have turned controversial. I mean, you can just go back to COVID right now, right? And you can see the different responses and reactions to COVID. So I think if anything, diseases are more polarizing now than ever before. The part that, from my standpoint, that sort of resonates with people the most when you talk about chronic wasting disease is this ability for the prions or the infectious agent to remain infectious in the environment. And there have been studies where like deer or elk have been fenced in, in a research facility and had CWD, have been removed, and the area was, soil was scraped away, the area was essentially disinfected, and they brought new animals in, and those animals still contracted the disease. So this ability for environmental transmission to occur is one of the more challenging aspects of this disease, and right now is limiting our ability to do anything with this disease in terms of a management response, to be honest with you. Why it's so polarizing. I think the biggest part of chronic wasting disease that I've heard is that, CWD moves very slowly. It is progressive, and places that have been documenting CWD for a while show increasing what we call prevalence rates. And we're finding it in seemingly new locations, but you're not seeing necessarily impacts on the landscape at least with white-tailed deer. So you're seeing this spread occur, and you're seeing a lot of discussion and emphasis placed on this disease, but people aren't seeing the impacts on the landscape. And then when you can contrast that with a disease like episodic hemorrhagic disease, which is a viral disease, and occurs, every couple years in the Midwest, typically in droughty type years. Mm-hmm. But you see deer that are just dead on the landscape, and you can smell them as you walk into the woods, and you can see dozens of deer that have died from this virus. There's this confusion in terms of why there's so much emphasis placed on chronic wasting disease and not enough emphasis placed on episodic hemorrhagic disease, because you're seeing a tangible impact from episodic hemorrhagic disease with deer that are either dead or dying on the landscape, and you go to a CWD and you're not necessarily seeing that from the deer herd perspective.
Is that a legitimate argument or concern? Because it said that CWD is 100% lethal, right? But how many deer actually die from CWD that contract it? Is that a legitimate thing? If we're not really seeing the effects of CWD that greatly, is this more of a fear-based reaction to the potential we perceive of it versus what it is currently?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that's up for debate, and I think it's one of the things that has caused a lot of agencies to revisit their talking points on chronic wasting disease, because you're right. And Michigan's as guilty as this as anybody else. When chronic wasting disease first comes out, there's a couple pictures that were taken in penned in facilities out west where they've had CWD for years. And those are the images that are constantly circulated about. And it's not meant to be a fear-based factor. I know it comes across as that, but it's meant to show like this is what could happen at the end stages of chronic wasting disease. And it usually takes about 18 months to 2 years for an animal to contract the disease and before they start showing symptoms of it. So they can actually live with chronic wasting disease and live a fairly normal life up until the point where the disease is just sort of taken over. And that's when they start to experience neurological symptoms, and they're not eating. They start literally wasting away to skin and bones. And then ultimately, if something doesn't kill them before the disease does, in that compromised state, the disease will actually kill them. So yeah, it's really caused a lot of agencies to rethink, because you're right, Adam, in that most people, even if you're saying like you're hunting in a CWD spot, you're not seeing these sick animals on the landscape. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is because they can live with it for, like I said, almost 2 years before they show those symptoms, some even longer. Two, that prevalence rates tend to be still at this time fairly low. If you only have 1 out of 100 deer or 5 out of 100 deer contracted with the disease, the odds of finding one of those animals is relatively still pretty small. And two or three, a lot of deer don't live that long. If you get a 3.5-year-old deer on the landscape, certainly if it's a buck, he's beating the odds, right? He's
definitely in Michigan.
Yeah, definitely in Michigan. The does will live a little bit longer for sure, but the bucks seem to be, have a little bit higher prevalence rates compared to the does. And there's some theories behind that, but they're not living that long. And there's also this other theory out there that, what we detect as humans in terms of, what might be a visibly sick deer versus a not sick deer, the gradient might be a little bit different if there are any type of predators on the landscape involved. So they might be able to pick into cues that highlight a sick deer out of a group, where we might still think it's, a relatively healthy deer. So the thought there is that if there is any type of predation that might be occurring on those deer that are more susceptible or have the disease, before it gets to that full-blown symptomatic skinny deer circling with loads of saliva coming out of its mouth.
Yeah, I think one of the, it wasn't the DNR, but I've heard people talk about it like, I think there are fear-mongering groups out there, or people that like call them zombie deer or whatever, the zombie deer disease, and I don't think that's helpful. But DNRs around the country, DNR agencies have been trying to do things. Could you give us a picture of what has been done and if it's working or not, and how we know if it's working or not up to this point?
Yeah. So our state in Michigan, when we first detected chronic wasting disease, it was back in 2015. And shortly after that, a national document came out. It was put together by a group of wildlife biologists, wildlife veterinarians, various health specialists, et cetera. And it's basically labeled the best management practices for chronic wasting disease. And since that document came out, we've tried to align our responses to that document, just because it's it's the one document out there that is formalized and put together by a group of experts. And I would argue that, to be an expert in chronic wasting disease is very difficult, and it's very rare because there's still so much to be learned about it. There are people who have studied it intently and are very good, and I'm fortunate to have access to some of those individuals, but I certainly wouldn't classify myself as an expert on it. Some of the things that we've done, a lot of our initial responses largely came from the standpoint of deer management, to be honest with you. It was trying to get hunters to kill more deer in those areas. So we changed our license structure around a little bit. We basically tried to make it a lot easier for hunters to kill deer. We pulled antler point restrictions off. We did that regulation change that I think I mentioned previously with allowing antlerless deer to be taken on basically traditional buck licenses, expanded seasons, things like that. But then we've gone into other things that have been recommended by this document. One is prohibiting baiting and feeding on the landscape. One is trying to reduce or prohibit carcass transportation out of those what we call endemic zones where CWD rates are a lot higher. Same thing with interstate deer or elk transport. We're basically saying don't bring in the likely more contagious parts of the deer or elk or moose from states that are known to have chronic wasting disease.
So my next question to what you just said is then, how do we know? So there's these suggestions of how to deal with it from experts. Is there any data to show us what we're doing, how it's affecting or not, how it's affecting the spread? Because it's still spreading, right? It's still there, it's still prevalent. We're finding more and more. We can talk about maybe the reasons why in a bit, but is there data to back up that what we're doing is working or not? Or have we even been measuring that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And, if I'm being honest, I don't think we have data to support that shows, that risks are being mitigated. You're always, when you develop a regulation like this, and it's based on sort of a best management practice or some sort of unknown, you're always comparing it with a scenario that now doesn't exist. Like we prohibited baiting and feeding in the lower peninsula of Michigan, and we've been like this for 4 or 5 years. Are we in a better place, a worse place, or the exact same place as we would be with chronic wasting disease had that regulation never been impacted? And I don't have an answer for you, to be honest with you.
So, do we really know if what the state DNR agencies are doing is actually helping or hurting? Next is Dr. Bronson Strickland of the MSU Deer Lab with his take, and pay attention to what he says are 2 things that make CWD so difficult to combat.
How are we doing currently with our handling of it, I guess, as far as like from the state level? And what do you think is the actual solution? Because there's a lot of struggling with even figuring that out.
Yeah. I think we're doing about as well as could be expected. When you have a contagious prion disease that can remain in the soil, for a decade or longer, whether that results in infecting another deer, nobody knows yet. So the science has still a lot to be learned about this kind of stuff. But I think, and this varies from place to place, and some state agencies have had, different strategies. But it is so reliant on hunters as well. It's whether hunters are taking it serious and whether they're following the rules. But what in my mind makes CWD so difficult are 2 things. It's very different because it's a long term, hence the word chronic, not only on how it affects the individual, but how it affects the population. EHD is very tangible, it's very easy for people to see and understand because it's a discrete event that happens in a year and you can see carcasses. Chronic wasting disease is very different. It's not a year event, it's a decade or two event. And it's very slowly will it take its toll on a deer population. Reproductive rate and survival just starts diminishing slightly and slightly every year. And so it's one of those where it's like 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road, it's like, oh my gosh, we got a big difference now on the landscape of the number of deer we have. So I think human beings, not just hunters, human beings are difficult modifying their behavior on something that takes that long to manifest, to see a tangible difference. The other thing that's difficult is we don't have a solution at this point. There's no cure. There's no vaccine. There's no shot. We can, there really are no good answers right now. And that, to me, when you put both of those together, it's just people aren't going to accept it and cooperate.
Yeah, it's and even if you did, have a vaccine, how do you give it to a wild population? There's
Exactly.
so many hurdles, I guess, to get over there.
Up next, we have Dr. Karl Miller, former professor at the University of Georgia Deer Lab. Take note of what he thinks is scary about CWD and what he thinks the deer herd could look like decades from now if it isn't handled.
What do you feel is our biggest threat to white-tailed deer as a resource, or the white-tailed deer herd?
That is a huge question. I think clearly CWD, diseases in general, but CWD, chronic wasting disease, over the long term has the greatest potential to have a negative impact on our deer hunting and our deer herds. First of all, we know that if dependent on prevalence rates, deer populations can decline in response to CWD. We've seen that happen. It's been documented. But not only that, how we manage the deer herds is going to change as well, because we're going to see, we know that CWD has its highest prevalence rate in mature bucks, and their survival rate is extremely low because of that. And we're not going to be seeing a lot of those areas that have traditionally produced a lot of big mature bucks that we're always looking for. They're going to become less and less prominent because they're going to die off before they get to maturity. But I think probably even bigger than that, as far as CWD is concerned, is how the hunter is going to respond to it as well. Particularly the hunter that has to hunt in a CWD area. There are a lot of hunters who probably are going to continue hunting, but there are probably a lot of hunters who say, well, I'm not going to take a risk. And we're going to see populations of hunters decline because of that. And hunters are what foot the bill for deer management across this country. And, DNR with license sales and Pittman Robertson taxation and so forth. When we start seeing declining populations of hunters, we're going to see declining resources for managing those deer herds. Mm-hmm. So that one kind of it's all wrapped up together. And right now, there is absolutely nothing on the horizon in at least the near term, a way of stopping it. And it's, there's a lot of areas where it doesn't occur yet, but it will. Yeah. It's spreading and it's continuing to spread. Every year there's new areas, that go positive for CWD.
How do you feel we're doing and handling it right now? And do you think there's better things we can do? Like I recently talked to a couple people about this and the idea of the genetic potential solution with different markers, I guess, that certain deer have they're more resistant to it and others that are more susceptible to it. What do you think about all that? And I guess how we're doing now and what might be a potential direction that we should be taking?
Yeah. The idea that some are more resistant to it, that's known that there are certain genetic factors associated with that, but that doesn't mean they don't get it and they don't succumb to it. It just takes them longer. So, that's not a cure. That's just a ray of hope that the deer are going to survive and maybe reproduce 1 more year or 2 more years longer. There is a glimmer of hope that there could be a vaccine developed, but that is a long time down the line. And if they ever is developed, is there a way of ever administering it?
Yeah. How do you
we've done it with rabies vaccines for things like raccoons and stuff like that with aerial seeding, but that's a long time coming if it ever does come. So, reduction in deer herd reduces transmission, obviously, but, the bottom line is deer come in contact with other deer. They're going to transmit it to other deer. Even if you completely depopulate an area and put new deer in, there's going to be the prions are going to persist in the environment for however long. That once it's there, and that's scary. That's really scary. Hopefully, there are some young minds out there that are much more clever than some of us old guys that hopefully they can figure some of this out.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say to this, idea or stance that deer are so resilient, and that they've survived a lot of different things over the thousands of years or however long they've been around, that this is just another thing that they will actually, by themselves, adapt to and get through?
In the absence of management, some of you will see a shift in their genetics based on some of these that are more resistant, right? And will it absolutely eliminate deer? No, deer will survive as a species. I don't think there's an issue. We're going to have young deer herds because we're not going to see a lot of deer get into the older age classes. But that's not any different than we had 30, 40 years ago, right? when we shot all the deer when they had their first set of antlers. So right. We'll have a young age class of deer. Are deer going to naturally adapt and figure out a way to evolve themselves out of this? For that kind of work, natural selection to work, you have to have a gene that would cause survival. And I don't see unless there's some type of mutation that occurs that a deer will become completely immune to CWD.
Okay, so here's your high IQ moment. So when it comes to CWD, I'll add in the response many hunters make, which I hear, not represented with our guest maybe in the lineup, which is, so what? Is it really that bad? It reminds me of growing up in the 80s and when they discovered the infamous hole in the ozone layer. But here's what we didn't know. Was it always there and therefore not a big deal, or was it actually man-made and something to worry about? Much like our testing of CWD, the more we test, the more we seem to find, but when did it arrive and how? Many times these things are impossible to know. The real question, I think, is what can we actually do about it and what can't we? Firmly understanding what our role is and what is and is not within our control, I believe, does help us to temper our response. Do we do nothing and regret it? Or overreact and also cause our own regrettable harm? This is a tough one and something to think about as we finish this episode. And I want to invite you to check out a few helpful things here with Deer IQ. First is our private Facebook group where we actually talk more about these topics and have further discussions. Our Instagram to connect and talk with me there, and also join our newsletter so you don't miss any of our weekly high IQ content, which also includes our blog and other videos. And if you struggle to be consistent year after year on the top deer where you hunt, many of us do, our new surgical hunting small group may be for you. I guide members through a proven method that anyone can apply to up their odds and become a much more deadly hunter. It's a 6-month interactive group I'm leading that is starting soon. So email me with questions and how to join. All those links are below. Okay, and now back to the podcast with a guest known as the Deer Professor is Conquest Deer Farm owner Doug Roberts. Pay close attention to what he says about the potential genetic solution and how deer farmers may be the best way to test this potential solution to CWD. And then we'll wrap up with Chad Stewart again, who discusses some points that Doug makes.
Okay, Doug, got a question for you on CWD. This is a big and controversial issue, really what it's turned into in the deer hunting realm. And it seems like everybody I talk to, depending on their kind of lane or what their expertise is, views it differently. So a common hunter seems to view it differently than a scientist, than DNR, than like you, a deer farmer. But let's talk CWD. What's your, I guess, take on it as far as how we've dealt with it? Have we done a good job or not as far as dealing with it, trying to cure it or not, and what's it look like as far as going forward in the future and in managing with CWD?
Well, CWD is definitely, as far as we know right now, definitely a disease. It was interesting. A couple months ago, the USDA infectious disease department of USDA did a study on it. And what they came up with is that basically CWD genetically, the markers are identical to scabies in sheep. Now, if anyone knows the true history of where CWD came from out west, they were studying scabies in sheep. And after they were done doing the studies, they brought in mule deer, they brought in elk, and they started doing studies, and they found that these animals, or some of those animals, were showing the same signs and symptoms that the sheep were with scabies. And so what they then found out was, with all of the sheep farmers out west that did the free grazing and free ranging on federal properties, some of those sheep that had scabies, which doesn't affect humans. So there's no transfer problem or anything like that, but it was killing a large number of sheep and even wild sheep. They were infecting all the environment out there where the mule deer were, where the elk were, where some of the whitetails were. And so it got into the environment, got into the wild herd, and started spreading from there. When it first came out almost 40 years ago and we found it, nobody really knew what to do. And so everyone, tried to do the best that they knew and comparing it to other things. They compared it to mad cow disease, scabies, and so on. But they also said some things that have showed up not to be true. One, once it gets into a herd of animals, deer, elk, whatever, it's going to wipe the whole herd out. Well, 40 years later, there's no place in the US or Canada that the entire herd has been wiped out, except where the DNR agencies have gone in and have tried to kill everything. And they weren't even successful. Wisconsin was the biggest place that they tried to do that, and they couldn't even kill all the wild deer, because as soon as you create this open vacuum of space, the deer in the outer areas are going to come to it and fill it back up. And so what they did is they did this boomerang effect. They killed all the deer in this area. All the deer in the outside area went into it. Too many went into it, so a bunch of them went back out, and they took the disease with it. The other thing that's disappointing is they kept saying it was going to transfer to people, and it hasn't done that. And now with USDA's department saying it's identical to scabies, that chance of transmitting to humans has really gone down to not being able to happen. From our standpoint, the deer farming standpoint, it's disappointing because all of the DNR agencies have said we're going to try to stop or slow the spread of the disease. I've never heard them say we're going to eliminate it, we're going to get rid of it, we're going to stop it. It's always we're going to slow the spread. In other words, we're going to admit that it's going to be everywhere at some point. The deer farming industry has taken a different direction. We've said we're going to eliminate it and we're going to stop it, at least in the deer farming industry. And most hunters don't know what the deer farming industry has been doing, what they are doing. And so this is a good time where we can explain some of those things. First of all, we found that if you can balance the pH in a deer system, the prions in that deer don't have the ability to misfold. And we have found that this humic acid and other vitamins and minerals will help keep the pH level balanced in a deer's system, which allows their kidneys and livers to remove heavy metals. Heavy metals are really the secret to the misfolding of the prions. So they're allowed to get rid of all of that. And as long as they're allowed to get rid of that, prions don't misfold for some reason. The other thing the deer farming industry has found is that there are genetic markers in certain deer that have resistance to catching and intaking the disease from the environment. Dr. Haley did some work a number of years ago, and he came up with a letter system. There were G's, there were H's, there were K's, there were S's, and there's always two markers together. In other words, a GG or a GS or a KS, but there's always those combinations. And what we found over the last, 10 years is that GG is highly susceptible to CWD in the environment. In other words, if I have a contaminated area and I put a GG deer in there, it's going to catch CWD within 6 months. We know that. We've done the study. On the other hand, if we take an S animal, an SS or an SK, or even an SG sometimes, put it in that same environment, it doesn't catch the disease for a length of time, a number of years. And so the deer farming industry has started breeding the resistant deer and getting rid of the susceptible deer. And so we're literally breeding the genetic markers for resistance, and we're breeding CWD right out of a herd. After Dr. Haley did that work, we went to Dr. Seabury. Now, Dr. Seabury is the person that literally figured out the genetic markers in sheep to breed scrapies out of existence. And they did it within 15 years. He found approximately 250,000 markers in sheep, and we're able to put them on this line and go, okay, this sheep is highly susceptible, this sheep is highly resistant, breed this line here and you won't have a problem getting scrapies in your sheep. And it worked. We hired him to do the same thing with the white-tailed deer. But because of cost, we could only afford about 53,000 markers. Now understand, Dr. Haley had 7 markers. Dr. Seabury's work has 53,000. But by using both of those, we're now being able to be more accurate on what we breed on our farms for resistance and increase the resistance in our herd. So at Conquest Deer Farm, we have been doing breeding for resistance now for about 7 to 8 years. And almost every deer on our farm has some level of resistance to CWD, which is all good news, because now we're trying to figure out how do we transfer this information into the wild deer herd? How do we help the DNR agencies with the wild deer herd? There's a little bit of resistance there because they're the agency that oversees the white-tailed deer. A lot of them don't feel we should have white-tailed deer. We should be raising them. It should all be theirs. Minnesota's going through an ordeal right now. A few other states have gone through ordeals, but hunters have to understand that if we're going to fight and beat a disease, the studies have to come from the deer farming industries where we can have control measures and we can monitor, have the same genetics and really monitor what we're doing, and then take that information and transfer it to the wild deer. So hopefully that can be done, but there's a lot of progress that has happened over the last number of years. And what CWD is, how to get rid of it, and how to genetically breed it out of the white-tailed deer herd. What hunters and people have to understand is the DNR agency is very good at what they do. They manage all the wildlife. And when you think about all the wildlife, all the water, all the fish, all the birds, they have a very daunting task. What they're not taught or trained to do is fight a disease. That's not their expertise. That's USDA's, that's the Department of Agriculture's specialty, If you look at what USDA and the Department of Agriculture, like here in Michigan, does, they do nothing more than fight diseases in all types of animals. The people that are good at stopping and fixing diseases aren't in the DNR agency. The problem is the DNR agency has to give up the control and allow the right agency to run the right studies and do the right testing to stop the disease, and they won't do that. Now, they'll tell you all day long they're working together. I've been in this, like I said, 32 years. The working together is very, very minimal, at least here in Michigan, because I'm in the political world of it all.
So I guess as a hunter, just speaking generally here, what should hunters do then? I know, a lot of states are encouraging everybody to get their deer tested and all this. I wonder personally, what are you doing with this data? Because if they don't have a plan, what are you doing with it? But what would you be, I guess, your thoughts on, okay, this is the solution. This is how hunters can actually help get there.
Hunters have to do a couple things. First, they need to ask their DNR agency, okay, how are you going to stop CWD? Now, you and I already know the answer. They don't have an answer for that. All they're doing now is looking for it, and when they find it, we're going to kill the deer in that area. That's their process, and it's to slow the spread. Well, the problem is you've already got an contaminated environment. So as soon as you shoot the deer out of that area, the deer in the surrounding area are going to come back in. And so you're not going to fix the problem that way. Secondly, we now know that the chance of it transferring to humans is basically non-existent. So stop worrying about eating an infected deer. Out west, they've been eating mule deer and elk for years with it. And if you go out west of those states, you go, well, what are you doing in regards to CWD? How are you? They're like, we don't even worry about it. It's no big deal out there. Here, you got to understand, here, it's a moneymaker. Michigan's DNR just got $4 million in the name of CWD. Well, that's a lot of money to their budget. They don't want to lose that. If this disease goes away, their budget goes away. So that's where we say it becomes a political issue. It is a legitimate disease.
Right.
We don't know what always causes it. The farming industry now knows how to stop it, but yet financially, for a lot of people, a lot of agencies, it's a moneymaker. And so they don't really want it to go away.
So I recently talked to a deer farmer, and I want to get your reaction on this. Because in my mind, I would think the goal would be to, again, as you said, have data to back up why we are doing X, Y, or Z. And how do we get that data and how do we measure that effectively to then drive those decisions? So this deer farmer, I'll tell you, is Doug Roberts from Conquest Deer Farms. I don't know if you know him. But he said these things, and I want to get your take on it. He said, initially the fear was it's going to wipe out deer herds. He said, that hasn't happened, right? It's going to possibly jump to humans. As far as we know, hasn't happened. And he said this, yes, it's a disease that causes problems. It doesn't seem to be causing the problems we originally thought, but there's this battle. We have a disease. We don't know how to stop it. We don't know how to eliminate it. We're just becoming very good at finding it, right? And so that's where the DNR comes in and the increased testing. So I'd like to get your reaction to that and thoughts on that, and also the idea of a question I raise, which is, how big of a problem is this really? And are we just finding that it's spreading by testing, or are we just testing more so we're finding that it's there, but we don't really know if it's always been there or not? Like, that might be a lot to answer at once, but what's your reaction first?
I might need to have you break some of that down because there's a lot going on there. But I mean, I think Doug brings up some really good points, and yeah, I know Doug. I wouldn't say I know him well, but we've been in meetings before, and he's super knowledgeable. Obviously, as you probably experienced through your talk with him. yeah, some of the early discussion early on was that, my gosh, this is going to spread. It's going to, I think there is even probably a paper published, this could result in extinction, extirpation, whatever word you want to use, of a localized deer herd within X number of years. And that time frame was still pretty long, but there were concerns, and that was sort of the prediction, based on that model. And we haven't seen that. And I think one of the reasons we haven't seen that is that we're underappreciating how resilient a white-tailed deer herd is. When you talk about white-tailed deer, I mean, this is an animal whose ancestors were hunted by like saber-toothed cats, right? Like they've been around for a very long time. And they are incredibly reproductive. And, we talked previously that, hunter numbers are going to continue to decline, and that's how we manage deer. So, the natural trend is for deer populations actually to probably increase, even with the presence of chronic wasting disease. I think the concern is long-term in what this looks like with our deer herd long-term. And, the example I'll bring forward is, if this slowly spreads to 100% of deer, like white-tailed deer, and I know that's an exaggerated number because that's a lot to do, right? And they're contracting this disease at, basically infancy. They're getting it from their maternal, their mother. If things remain the same and you get a 2-year cycle or a two-year limit in terms of how long that deer can live for, one, your odds of shooting a 3.5 or 4.5-year-old buck are going out the window. Like if it's widespread and deer are contracting it early because it's just across the environment, how are you going to shoot a 4.5-year-old buck if the disease is going to kill it within 2 years? You're not going to do it, right? There's also the potential for it to, I wouldn't say eliminate deer, but I would say there's a potential for it to certainly compromise growth of the deer herd. So again, if you're a fawn and you pick up the disease and you take that little sand hourglass thing and turn it over, and it's a 2-year time frame at this point, how long is it before most fawns are actually reproducing and contributing to the population? Some are doing it within a year because fawns in agricultural areas, warmer areas, can be bred at 7, 8, 9 months, and they can have a fawn, that first summer or that next summer that they're around. Most of them, though, takes 2 years to start contributing because they're bred at a year or a year and a half, and then they're having a fawn at 2 years old. So again, the potential is if this becomes widespread, it could have population level impacts, not necessarily extinction level impacts, but it could compromise your hunting quality in the future. And I say knowing that you and I won't experience this impact at all because it's very slow moving and it takes a long time for this to spread out. I'm talking like generational impacts. And I think that's where my concern comes from. Not that, this is going to wipe out deer in the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think that's ever been really said, but I think that's the interpretation. And I think there's a disconnect in how the impact of this disease is communicated. We should be talking about this in terms of decades later and what can we do today to make sure that this worst case scenario doesn't come forward compared to how's it going to impact my hunting.
Yeah, I would agree with what you just said, that the interpretation by most people is more short term than long term, and maybe there's a big disconnect there with a lot of people. Would you also agree, me just kind of summarizing what you just said, that most DNR's reactions to this are based on worst case scenario type things?
Yeah, it is. And so here's also where I think some of the disconnect, I'm just kind of speaking real here, Adam. I think where the disconnect is that as someone who's employed in this position, our responsibility is to protect against the worst case scenario, because we're managing this resource in the public trust. And, you know, the analogy I bring forward is that, you know, if you're the head of your household and managing finances, you want to protect your investments from a worst case scenario. You know, you're not like just letting everything fly into this thing that could really well pay off, or it could collapse and leave you with nothing. You know, a smart person tries to moderate that a little bit, but you are protecting against the worst case scenario by not putting all of your money into this, you know, new stock or new cryptocurrency or whatever, because if it fails, you're broke. And what the departments and most game agencies do is try to make regulations to at least try to protect against that worst case scenario. It might seem excessive, it might seem over the top, but we're trying to at least raise awareness and protect against that. And is it the appropriate response? I don't know, but I think a lot of agencies feel that that's the responsibility, is to not do something that in the future would cause us to go broke, dear broke.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But I think it is a big disconnect with people. My next question, which was in that long series there, was, you know, do we really know when CWD entered the scene? Do we know how prevalent it was before we started testing, or is our testing just revealing what's there, not necessarily how long it's been here? You know, like, how do we know that it hasn't always been here fairly prevalently? We're just increased testing, so we're finding it, right? Versus the idea that, oh, it's spreading, right? Because we're testing and we're finding it. Like, do we even know the difference in that?
Yeah, to some extent we do, I think. And I mean, your point's valid. Like, when CWD was first discovered, I want to say it was like 1967. It was sometime in the 60s, and it was like in a facility in Colorado. And then they look around elsewhere and they find a couple here and there, and then slowly spreads to a few other states. But, you know, the first time that it was identified east of the Mississippi River was in Wisconsin in 2002. And before that time frame, no states were looking for chronic wasting disease.
Right.
At that time, it was thought of as being a Western disease, and like this, you know, maybe this thing that's maybe only in mule deer or elk, maybe occasionally white-tailed deer. And then it got into Wisconsin. And if you look at the history of a lot of states in the Midwest and maybe even the Northeast and Southeast, when their first original CWD management and response plan was developed, it was probably around 2002 or 2003. And that's because once Wisconsin found it, a lot of other states were like, oh, hell, this could be us too. We need to figure this out. So there wasn't a lot of historical surveillance or sampling in those areas. But a lot of states started at that point. And maybe it was insufficient to do a lot of detection, but there has been a history that's been built up over time. A lot of places still don't have a very robust history. And you're right. If you find it, you don't really know how long it's been there. There are some really good people that are good at modeling and tracking things that might be able to backtrack it if they have enough data to provide an estimate. But what we're seeing is that in places that there is a like a historical time frame where there've been surveillance, or like take Wisconsin, for example, where, once they found it, they've been sampling there for 20 years. And what they're finding is that it is growing in that area because there is this expansion or increase that's occurring in that area where it's been detected. And then there are places that have, a history that you can compare against where, well, we've been looking here for 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And all of a sudden it pops up. So the point is valid in that there are a lot of places that don't have that history, and you don't really know what's happening. And then once you start looking there, it's there. And that's true. There is more sampling and there's more detections because of that. But in places where that history has existed, they are showing increases and expansions occurring simultaneous to that.
I guess the question now is, what is the solution? We know we can test for it well now. What is the current solution? I did talk to Doug again about some of the potentials that he saw, but as far as a DNR agency, okay, we can find it now, right? We can test for it, but now what? What do we do with this?
Yeah, I would say we don't have a solution for it right now. We have a lot of suggestions that we think will limit the impact or the spread. But in terms of a solution, honestly, if I had the answer to what the solution for chronic wasting disease was, I wouldn't be working for the Department of Natural Resources. I'd have my own company and making a lot of money off of it. But we don't have that solution. I think, like you said, we're getting really good at detecting it. There's some new innovative ways to detect it earlier that still need to go through a couple of, my understanding, approval processes. But there's some really good promise and potential. But that solution, from my standpoint, doesn't exist yet, at least from a free ranging standpoint. Doug might have some thoughts, and maybe he's I know some things that are being worked on in the captive industry. And that may or may not be applicable to free-ranging deer.
Yeah, so one of the things that people bring up a lot is these similar diseases in other species, like sheep with scabies, and how they, according to what I understand, genetically have gone to a genetics as a solution. Like these different markers, genetic markers that a sheep would have that would allow it. It was pretty susceptible to scabies versus a different marker that it was pretty resistant to it. And then so you start breeding to selective breeding, basically, to the resistant markers, and pretty soon the herd is resistant to it, and you start wiping it out genetically, right? So is that a potential solution that the DNR is looking at and using deer farmers to help with that research? Because one of the things we talked about earlier is if you just start throwing things at a wild deer herd, there's so many variables, it's hard to, you don't have a controlled environment to actually get good data or results for what you're trying to test. Is using deer farms, which is a much more controlled environment, to run some of these tests, maybe genetic type solutions, a good place to start. So again, if it's a long-term disease, we have some long-term solutions for that. Is that something that DNR is considering at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of value that can be provided by captive cervid owners for some of this research with chronic wasting disease, and I think that there's a lot of willing and motivated individuals in that industry that have some creative thoughts on how to advance our knowledge of this disease. And like you just said, like the genetic breeding, I think, is one thing that that's the perfect environment for that. When you talk about manipulating, the genetics of a population, you can probably understand pretty quickly that that's much easier done in a captive facility than a wild free-ranging deer herd. So there are some challenges to that approach, from the outside the fence perspective. But if that is being looked at inside fences, and there's a lot of promise with that approach, which I don't know if it is or not. My understanding is that there are different levels of what I would call, like I think you said, resistance with chronic wasting disease based on specific genetic codes. And that might be beneficial from a CWD standpoint. But my also understanding is that it doesn't make them immune to contracting the disease, or if that exists, it hasn't been identified yet. So you're talking about an animal that, under one genetic code might die within 2 years, compared to a resistant code that might die after 5 years naturally. And, that's still tremendous progress. That's something, but I don't know if we have that immunity decision based yet. The other thing that I think is worth considering, especially as we talk about a free-ranging deer herd, is that if that resistant genetic type is around at low numbers and it just simply needs to be expanded in our wild herd, I think the question that we need to ask is, why is that not selected for naturally up to this point? If that was the more robust genotype that exists out there, why are they in the minority compared to these others that are susceptible? And sort of the example that I bring up in humans is like sickle cell anemia. If you have sickle cell anemia, you probably have some health problems associated with that. That's not a desirable, or if you have that trait that carries sickle cell, it's a desire that nobody's really asking for that. But if you happen to live in an area that has endemic malaria, having that trait is beneficial because it protects you against malaria. So these are the type of things that I think need discussed before we start shifting broadly genotypes in our deer herd or considering that as a solution to CWD. We need to ask, what are the repercussions of that? Are these, is this genotype just are they just a bunch of bad mothers that abandon fawns, and that's why their genotype is not expressed broadly to begin with? Are we trading one problem in for another? So it's a great question to ask, and I think it's a great conversation to have, but there's a lot more questions that come about it than things are rarely that simple.
All right, and now for your high IQ takeaways and challenges. What do you think the actual path to a solution is, or might be, and how can us regular hunters actually be involved? Put it in the comments or head over to our Instagram or private Facebook group. I'll create a post there for you to share your thoughts on that. And next time, I'm co-hosting a podcast with Adam Miller of the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast as we discuss the controversial deer regulations proposed in our home state of Michigan. If you're in a different state, we want to know how your state compares, so please join us as well. We talk about APRs, one buck, how the DMI team and DNR might have really whiffed on a few things. You won't want to miss that, and I'll see you then.